Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'd like to thank Dr. Excel and the trustees of the museum for having me here. And it's really great to hear her say that the museum is going to think about a way to have people reintegrate ancient Egypt back into a place where it actually is, namely Africa. What's very interesting about that idea is that when you go back to the 19th century, you actually find out that it wouldn't have been strange to have said that ancient Egypt was in Africa. We often blame the 19th century and the early 20th century, but well, specifically the 19th century, for all of the racism, all of the problems, all of the bad ideas. But in actual fact, you'll find some variation in opinion, and you'll find some great contradictions, and you'll find some dissonance within the writings of the time, even from people who were slave apologists, etc. In fact, I want to read something to you from that time, and I think it's important that I not just tell you, but that I actually read it to you. Many of you may be familiar with Samuel George Morton, American physician who studied any number of Egyptian crania who were brought back to, that were brought to him by Glidden, who was in the consulate in Egypt. And Samuel Morton basically came to the conclusion that he discovered 4 types of people based on his cranial studies within Egypt. There was a core Egyptian type, which he said was Caucasian. There was a group that and they were the real Egyptians. There were others that he labeled Egyptian with Negro influence. There were others that he called Negroid, mixed Egyptian, quote, Negro. Negro doesn't have a cultural identity, it's just a biological entity. And a few odd, maybe, quote, pure Negro cranium. Now, Morton said and used Blumenbach's term Caucasian to describe the Egyptians, and you know, based on certain anatomical traits that he found in those skulls. And I will not discuss here completely the problematic of associating particular anatomical traits with particular regions. There is some validity in that for certain things, but what I want to get to is that this was Morton's conclusion, still in some quarters taken even at face value. The people that brought Morton those crania, Glidden and his associate Knott, actually disagreed after they began to see the plates that Lepsius and other people were, the plates of the finds from Egypt itself. Of course, they were looking at images. And they came to disagree with their friend and their great teacher, Morton, based on what they saw. They said, for example, it may on the other hand be equally true that the ancient Egyptians did present a type intermediate between other African and Asiatic races, and should such be proved to have been the case, the autochthones of Egypt must cease to be designated by the misnomer of Caucasian. They wrote this in 1854. They went on to say, but the first hour's glance over these delineations, the plates from Lepsius, enforced the conviction that the Egyptians of the earliest times did not correspond with our honored friends, Morton's, description, but with a type which, although not Negro, nor akin to any Negroes, was strictly African. A type, in fact, that supplied the long sought for link between African and Asiatic races. Let us ask, what trace of an Asiatic type does one perceive in these likenesses? Does not the low elongated head, the imperfectly developed forehead, the thick short nose, the large full lip, the short and receding chin with their two ensemble all point to Africa as the primeval birthplace of these people? And they go on. They note that Morton changed his own mind after correspondence with him, which is something that's not often talked about in the literature on the subject. what I wanted to illustrate with that is to say that here you have people who are associated with a particular way of thinking and who were racist and slave apologists, who nevertheless are disagreeing with, quote, the hard scientists of their day, the person who looked at skulls, because they're looking at plates. And they're saying, no, these people don't look like us. They don't look like us. Now, in the discussion, we can talk about subsequent writers down through Grafton Elliott Smith, down through Henri Frankfurt, all the way through even to the 1950s. And what you will see is that there is some variation in opinion. There's a conflict if you step back from what's been written and what's been found. So the question becomes, from an intellectual point of view, what happened to knowledge of this variation in opinion? What happened to, let us say, this dissonance, this tension? That is just as interesting to me as, quote, what is the real deal? Who are the people, in fact? So why do we have this situation? So here we have in the 1850s a disagreement here about a place of origin and even a phenotypic assessment. But what you don't have disagreement about is that although, according to Dr. Glidden, these people, they even use the word Negroid to describe them, but they are not related to real Negroes. That's the linchpin. That is the point that they say, well, these people are African, they're this, they're that, and they have this kind of cast of face, but they're not really related. And of course, for people who are interested in things like biological taxonomy, following Darwinian models, we believe that taxonomic schema should reflect somehow actual relationships, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So I wanted to set the stage sort of with this historical background of Elliott Smith in the early 1900s, and later a great anatomist said that the Egyptians belonged to something that he called the brown race. And the cradle for the brown race in Elliott Smith's writings and diagrams is Ethiopia. I mean, the Ethiopia of today, that region, the Horn of Africa. He has a nice diagram in one of his writings showing people coming up from the Horn of Africa into Egypt, into North Africa, actually into Arabia. And in fact, Elliott Smith asserted that the Italians, or the southern Italians, were part of this brown race. And of course, the Italian writers of the time really didn't like this because they really wanted to be associated more with Nordics and Northern Europeans. This is a time when there were said to be three European races, Nordic, Alpine, and Mediterranean. So we have to look at this entire context of information, this entire milieu. Having given you this background in extremely summary form, I want to talk about the techniques that essentially come from historical anthropology, which is actually a new term, to assess the issue of how would we talk about the peopling of any place. What sorts of methods, disciplines might be used in order to assess where a population came from. Methods really finally developed for Hawaii, for the Polynesians. They were a terminus point. They weren't people before 2,000 years ago, any more than Madagascar or Finland was. So you've got a point where you know the land is empty. So what kinds of evidence might one use to talk about who the people were that got there? And I need to also say something else that's extremely important. We must not confuse biogenesis with ethnogenesis. The two are not necessarily coterminous. You might have some very ancient lineages in your background that come from wherever, but that doesn't explain who you are at this moment in time. That's a very important concept.